Now that we've got Redis installed locally, we're going to play around with it a little bit to understand how it stores data. Once we have a better idea of how it works, we can then use it to implement caching inside of our application. Let's first start off by looking to see exactly how data is stored inside of Redis. So we're going to look at a diagram really quick. All right, right in the center of this diagram is our Redis instance. Redis is a key value store. So you can think of it as storing data very similarly to how a JavaScript object stores values. We have keys, and those keys reference different values. We're going to use the Node-REDIS library to eventually manipulate by setting and getting the values that are stored inside of Redis itself. The most basic way to manipulate values inside of Redis is calling this set function. The first argument is a key that we want to set, and the second argument is a value. So if we called set with hi and there, we would end up with a key in Redis of hi and a value of there. Now to eventually retrieve values out of here, we can use the get function provided again by Node-REDIS. The first argument to get is the key that we want to retrieve. Now notice that in this case, whenever we are trying to retrieve a value out of Redis, that is an asynchronous operation. So we have to pass in a callback function as a second argument. This callback function right here will eventually be called with the value that was stored at the key of hi inside of Redis. So in this case, if we called get and tried to get the value at hi, our callback function would eventually be called with a value of there, because that's value. Now I can talk about all this stuff all day, and it, may or may not be helpful. I think that would be a little bit nicer to actually write some code to interact with our Redis instance. I think we could learn a lot more if we took that type of approach. So I'm going to change back over to my terminal. I'm going to make sure I'm inside of my root project directory, and then I'm going to start up my node REPL by running the node command like so. We're going to directly require in the Redis library. We're then going to use that library to connect to our running Redis instance, and then we're going to try to manipulate some of the data stored in there. So let's first require in the Node-REDIS library. I'm going to say const redis is require redis, like so. Again, I'm calling this library Node-REDIS just so you know what I'm referring to, but technically it is called Redis. We then have to instruct this Redis library how to connect to our client instance. We can do so by defining first a Redis URL. So this is going to be the URL that our instance is running at. So I'm going to say const redis URL. And by default, your connection URL for the copy of Redis that we just installed will be redis://127.0.0.1 and then port 6379, like so. We can then use the Redis library to connect to the instance at this URL and store the result on a variable called client by writing redis.createClient, and then we'll pass in the URL that we want to connect to, which is Redis URL, like so. So that gives us back this client thing, and this client thing is how we actually interact with our Redis instance. So if I reference simply client and print out the value, you'll see this big object right here that has a bunch of different methods on it that allow us to manipulate that Redis instance. Let's try writing some of the code that I just showed you on this diagram right here to try to store and retrieve a very basic value. So back over at the terminal, I'll write client.set. I want to set a key of hi and a value of there. Now notice how it immediately returns to me true. That just means, okay, I got it. I'm going to try to set that value for you. It doesn't actually represent the value that is being stored or anything like that. It's just a status message that lets us know that the client is doing its thing. Then to retrieve this value, we can call client.get, ask for the key at hi, and then pass in a callback function as well. So I'll write out client.get. I want to get the value that is stored at hi, and then as a second argument, I'm going to pass in a callback function. The callback function takes air as the first argument. So if something goes wrong while retrieving this key, it will be assigned, or an error object will be assigned to this value right here, or this argument. And then the second argument is the actual value that we're trying to retrieve. So I'll take that and simply console log it. All right, let's try running this. So now when I run this get to get the value stored at high, I see a console log of there appear. Yep, pretty straightforward. That's pretty much it. Now, one thing I want you to be aware of, writing out these callbacks right here is kind of annoying. So one way that we can kind of print out values a lot more easily is to write out client.get high, and then instead of writing out a full callback function, we can pass in a reference to console.log. Now notice that we do not have a set of parens after console.log, because we're not trying to call it, we are providing the log function as a callback. So after we fetch this information, after we fetch the value stored at high, console.log will be called automatically with the arguments of error and value. So let's try running this and see what happens. So now we get null in there. The first value right here of null is that error value. Null means that nothing went wrong with that operation. And then the second value we see console logged is there, and that's our actual value. So again, there's really no difference here, just a little shortcut so we don't have to write out a full callback function like so. Okay, so we now got a reasonable idea of how to set and get very basic values inside of Redis. But this isn't quite enough for us to really implement a caching layer. So let's continue in the next section, and we're going to write a little bit more code to figure out how to work with Redis.